So welcome to the October 18th Proxy meeting of the Teachers Retirement System. Present are Thad McTeague from TRS,
Cynthia Collins,
Deborah Penny,
John Dewessa from the Controller's Office.
Millicent Budai, Controller's Office.
Andrew Elcott, Controller's Office.
Michelle Taylor, Controller's Office.
Here.
Susan Stang from TRS.
Valerie Budwick, TRS.
and I guess with that I'll turn it over to Millie.
Okay, thank you. So our first item on the agenda is to seek your approval for some revisions to our proxy voting guidelines. Currently, the pension funds consider issues of diversity in casting some of our votes and in making some of our decisions. For instance, we filed a board diversity proposal for over a decade now. One thing we haven't done is explicitly put in the guidelines some criteria for when we would want to withhold directors based on lack of diversity. So we're proposing a change to our guideline, or an addition to the guideline, where if the board is less than 20% gender related, there are less than 20% women on board, that we have the authority to withhold the governance and nominating committee. Okay. Just to give it a little bit of a context, there is a movement in the space towards taking some action around gender diversity. If you look at the last page there, you'll see some of the actions that are being taken in the space by different organizations. BlackRock, for instance, expect a minimum of 2 women to be on the board to avoid withholding the nominating committee. Similarly, the New York State Common Retirement Funds require 2 women on board, or else they will withhold the nominating committee. And so we're kind of moving in that direction too. It's not a hard and fast rule in the sense that we are looking at diversity in general, so that if the board were to have, let's say, about a 30% diversity, that includes not only gender but race and ethnicity, then if it has less than 20% women on board, we would take that into consideration. Ideally, we would have liked to include race and gender in the discussion, but the data is not out there for us to make more definitive decisions around that. Okay. Currently, we're starting with last year, we're asking companies to disclose their skills matrix, and part of that is to disclose information around race and gender. So as soon as that becomes commonplace in the proxies, we might come back to you on an issue like that.
do you have a red line which shows what the prior guideline was and how what this change is?
Okay, so I think he put in there some things about how we used to consider it. If you look at
No, I understand that you've got, I'm asking about a red line. We're looking at changing an actual guideline that we have on, as Valerie said, on the website, and I asked if we could see a red line of how this is going to change our existing policy.
Okay, so no, I don't have a red line document. Okay. Well, what this would be an addition. So it wouldn't red line anything that's in there. It would be an addition. It would be an insertion, so to speak.
So I think what this is meant to do is, this is something that meaning the systems have been doing for quite some time, and how they've been voting proxies. It's never been memorialized anywhere.
Okay.
And I think that this is the opportunity to add it as an addition rather than change of an existing guideline, but in order to I guess memorialize how the boards have voted and how the boards find value in diversity, particularly gender diversity on corporate boards.
Also, the revision of the guidelines is something that happens periodically as new issues arise within the space. we come to you periodically to update the guidelines in terms of new voting recommendations.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying, you
Okay.
know, being able
Yeah,
to
no,
see
no, we
what the
didn't.
existing guideline is and how this is going to change.
It's just going to be, it's going to be an insertion in it, not a markup as such.
And I mean, just from a historical standpoint, the guidelines were overhauled within the recent past to become more concise and more consistent, and actually, what I would personally say, probably more readable. Over time, what had happened was the guidelines that were used by the city were organized in a fashion that made it difficult for outside parties to understand how we would be voting, and they were very specific to issues. I always use the analogy that the first item was acid rain when you looked at it, which was something that was being voted on, 20 some odd years ago. In the last couple of years, there's been a real desire to make that document more straightforward, easier for a person on the outside, a member of the public, or even corporate boards to read through those guidelines and say, this is definitely within the scope of what the city find valuable or supporting as agencies of the city.
I just
or how
think
we would
it's,
say it.
For me, seeing the entire guideline in front of me with a highlighted of what the changes would be, I just, to see the context.
So what I would say is, if we are fortunate enough to pass this today, with the new guideline, we can send out a copy tomorrow, or even I'll give you till tomorrow because I don't expect anyone going back to the office. But tomorrow morning we can actually send out a final draft that has this incorporated and all of the other changes, so you can see
Doesn't
an
the
actual.
board need to approve it? This is a recommendation to the board.
So each board handles it a little bit differently.
teachers do.
The proxy committee here, I believe, isn't responsible for all the proxies. Whether or not it needs to be ratified by the full board, I'd leave that up to. I'd leave that up to Val.
Does this go back to the full board? Actually, under the IPS, it does.
Okay.
So that's would be in November, but it's the proxy committee
Recommendation.
approves
Right.
the recommendation.
All right, so consistent with you wanting a markup, if you look on page 5, we had proposed some minor revisions to what is actually in place. These are not really changing anything substantially. What these are doing, items 1, 2, and 3, they're changing somewhat the wording to avoid confusion, because as the guidelines are now, as we vote the proxies, sometimes little phrases creates a little confusion for us who vote the proxies, and so items 1, 2, and 3 outline just a little clarification that we would do, not change it. So I'm guessing you would want to see.
I'm going to say, especially in light of this, I think that it
Understood.
would be more prudent to get the
markup.
markup with these, including these changes,
Point
so that we
taken.
would know what the guidelines in the entire document is that we were approving.
Okay. All right, so
I
we'll
mean,
get
we
that
could
done
do that.
ASAP.
Yeah, and then we could look at that, and maybe we could have just a conference call or something to approve. I mean, I don't think we'd have to do a full.
Okay, so we'll do the insertion of the new policy, and we'll do the markup
the
around these
markup on these
revisions.
revisions.
Okay, no problem.
So
And then if you can include council.
All right, or I'll send it to
Go back
John,
to
and
just
you can forward it to the relevant parties.
Yeah, that would be good.
So if there's nothing further in the public session, I would make a motion to enter into executive discussion, the executive session to discuss any pending items with specific companies. So it's a motion. Just need a second.
Second.
Thank you.
All in favor?
Aye.
We are in executive session.